everybody, welcome to Wildlife Wisdom. My name's Erica, and today I wanted to talk about zoo enclosures. So, the biggest complaint people will get about zoo enclosures is that it's too small for the animal. They're like, oh, they don't have enough room to run, oh, it's just too small, they don't have enough room. So the problem is that it's a lot more complicated than that. So zoo enclosures have a lot of other factors that go into them, so bigger is not necessarily better. For example, if you put a lion in a 1-acre enclosure, right when you put it in, which is fairly big for a zoo enclosure, by the way, when you put him in, he'll probably walk around the whole outside just to kind of check out everything. And then he's going to sit by his favorite tree, and he will lay under his favorite tree for the next 24 hours, for the next 48 hours. He'll just lay under the tree. And every single day, he will lay under that same tree and never go to the rest of the enclosure. Okay, so take that same lion and put him in a 10-acre enclosure, which is a huge enclosure. The lion will do exactly the same thing. He'll use exactly the same room. He might walk around all of it just to check it out, but then he's gonna go to his favorite tree, he's gonna lay under his favorite tree, and he's gonna stay there for hours and hours and hours. So when it comes to zoo enclosures, bigger is not always better. So there is a point when an enclosure can be too small, and yes, that is very detrimental to the animal. However, there comes a point when it's big enough and making an enclosure even bigger won't be helpful in any way or improve the animal's welfare. So I have never built or designed my own zoo enclosure, so I am not an expert, that's not my job. But there are a couple things that a good zoo enclosure will have, because you have to meet the animal's needs, you have to meet the zookeeper's needs, and you have to meet the visitor's needs. So first, accessibility. When you're designing an enclosure, you have to make sure that the animal and the zookeeper can access everywhere inside the enclosure, because they have to clean it. So that means you've got to think about where the drains are. If you have drains on the floors, you have to think about where the drains are. You've got to think about what kind of material you're using. Does this need to be scrubbed? Can it just be sprayed off? You need to think about the door, the kind of door you have. If a vehicle needs to be able to access the enclosure to get inside, do we have the right kind of doors, and are the doors big enough for the vehicle to get inside? Then you need to think about escape. So 99% of the time, a zookeeper won't be in any danger when they're in an enclosure, but if something were to happen, can the zookeeper escape quickly? Also, when it comes to accessibility, you got to think about moving the animal within the enclosure. So obviously, most animals, a zookeeper won't be in the enclosure with the animal at the same time. And those are going to include the really dangerous ones. It can include such as the big cats or the bears. So usually what people do is they will have the big normal enclosure, and that's the one that the visitors come and see. But then they have a separate, smaller, connected enclosure, usually where the guests can't see, but sometimes they actually have windows and openings. So that separates and closes off, but it still connects to the bigger one. So the zookeeper can come in, they can put enrichment, they can put food there safely, they can leave, then they can open the gate, and the animal can come in and get everything that it needs. Or you can get the animal and put it in the smaller enclosure and close the gate, so the zookeeper or whatever else needs can go into the bigger enclosure to clean, set up enrichment, everything that it needs to do. Now you need to think about lighting and design. So yes, space is a factor, but it is not the only factor. So is there enough lighting? Is it the proper kind of lighting? Because some animals need UV light, and they cannot be kept inside without special accommodations. Or if they're nocturnal, then you need to have a red light or different kind of light during the day so visitors can see them awake during the day and they can sleep at night. Okay, and now you need to think about safety. So that means the animal cannot get out of the enclosure, but not only the animal can't get out, but people can't get in, because that is a problem. People getting in or falling in. Because what happens is if people will jump in there for whatever reason, or if they fall in for whatever reason, there's a good chance the animal will be harmed in order to try to save that person. There's a good chance the animal will actually be killed in order to try to save that person. And so we need to protect the animal from people as much as we need to protect the people from the animal. Then you need to think about, do you have the right fencing? Is the fencing the right material? Can they climb it? Can they break through it? You have to make sure there's no toxic plants that they can eat. Everything inside the enclosure is safe. There's no wires they can eat. There's no plastic they can chew on. Is it protected from the weather? If the enclosure is outside, do they have a shelter, a separate shelter where they can get away from intense weather that they're not capable of handling? Is the enclosure high enough? Does it have enough height? You can't have, a giraffe is roughly 17 feet high, and so if you have a room that's only 18, 20 feet high, that's not going to be high enough for a giraffe. You have to think of they're going to need more headspace than that. Then you need to think of what is the enclosure made of. So you can't just throw in cement on the ground. For example, elephants and penguins, if the ground is too abrasive, they will get abrasions on their feet and they can get infected. You don't want the animal to injure itself inside the enclosure. And then there are other problems. For example, a lot of bird droppings are corrosive. And so you have to be careful of what floors you have, because it can eat away at it after time, and you're going to have to replace it again and again and again, and that becomes very costly very quickly and difficult to clean. If you have an aquatic enclosure, you've got to think about, is it deep enough for the animals? Is there enough water for how many animals you have contained inside? You need to think about, is the water chemicals balanced, because that's a tricky one. Is the temperature right? And of course you do need to think about size as well, because if an enclosure for one animal is not going to be big enough for several animals. You've got to think about overcrowding. You've got to think about the social groups that the animals need. You're going to have to worry about aggression, such as male-on-male aggression. You're going to have to worry about personalities, because some animals just don't get along with each other, and so you can't just shove them all into one enclosure. You may have to separate them. You also need to worry about hierarchies, because there are a lot of breeds that, hyenas for example, they are a matriarchal society. So that means they have a female matriarch, and then all of the females are higher, even the lowest female is higher than the highest male. And that causes a lot of fighting, and you've got to be aware of that and how the animals get along with each other. So now, keeping all of that in mind, now we need to talk about the people who come to the zoos, because people who come to zoos, they want to see the animals. And I'm sure all of us have been to a zoo where we look in the enclosure and we can't find the animal. And then we're frustrated. We're just like, we paid, we wanted to come in here and see it. The problem is, visitors' wants conflict directly with zookeeper and animal wants. Because an animal wants to hide. It wants privacy. Whereas a visitor wants to be able to see it. And so there's some trickery that needs to go on. There's some finagling there. There's some very careful layout of viewing windows and foliage that needs to go into play. People want really big, complex enclosures. Well, the problem is the zookeepers have to maintain it and to clean it and make sure it's safe for the animal. And the more complex and the bigger it is, the more difficult that becomes. So when it comes to zoo enclosures, bigger is not always better. Usually it's quality above quantity. If the enclosures are complex, they have the right foliage, they have the climbing equipment, they have the shelter, they have the space, they have all of the maintenance access and abilities and the cleaning, everything that needs to happen, it's considered a good enclosure. So looking at a zoo enclosure and saying, oh, it needs to be bigger, is not always the answer. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this explains a little bit more about the complexities of zoo enclosures and why it's a little bit more complex than just size. Let me know what you think down below, and if you have any more questions, let me know and I'll answer them in the comments. And I'll see you guys next time.